Welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe, with me, Tom Sherrington, and my great partner in crime, Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Hello, Tom. Are you well after half term?
Yeah, I had a special half term. I went to Venice, which was for the first time in my life, which was amazing. So I'm very excited about that, full of history, which is, I only saying that because our very special guest today, really neat segue, is the one and only Christine Counsell. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, Tom. Hello, Emma.
Hi.
Yeah, so I mean, you're someone who I think of as a big hitter. You're one of the people that people sort of look up to because you're very knowledgeable about education and obviously within the history community, but beyond that, and I've been a leading voice, I would say, over the last few years around curriculum and some of the debates that we've been having around knowledge-rich curriculum and where that's gone wrong. I know you wrote a fantastic article about that earlier this year. We'll talk a bit about that. But for people who might not know you, some of our audience are in the US and in Australia. Just tell people a little about what your work is and what sort of things you're working on at the moment.
Great, thank you, Tom. Yeah, I mean, I've kind of reinvented myself a few times, really, in terms of actual jobs. So, after a long career as a history teacher and then a history leader and so on, I ran the history PGCE course at University of Cambridge. So actually, the bulk of my background is in teacher education, in teacher training. But then latterly, I've done a range of things. I've been a director of education in a multi-academy trust. And subsequent to that, I began to work freelance and did a range of work, mostly in consultancy for leaders, chiefly around curriculum and around teacher education, school leadership and MAT-wide leadership, leadership across multi-academy trusts. But the main thing, I suppose, that I do 80–90% of my time now is a company that I founded about 4 years ago called Opening Worlds. And I did that with my colleague and business associate, Steve Mastin, because it seemed to me that there we all were, so many of us, saying how important curriculum is and how important knowledge is and how empowering it is. But actually, it's extraordinarily difficult for primary schools to be able to find the expertise, never mind the time, to actually build it's well nigh impossible, because there's hardly any non-contact time, and even if you have got some non-contact time, how on earth are you supposed to be an expert in science and geography and history and absolutely everything? So it struck me that a useful thing that could be done would be to produce not just a fully developed curriculum, but a fully resourced curriculum. And knowing how easily that can go wrong, and how stuff gets lost in translation, I and Steve Mastin, who's the co-founder with me, decided that we would create a kind of all-in package of curriculum and resources and training. And that's how Opening Worlds was born. And it was also born sort of partly by accident in a way, because it grew out of an invitation by Haringey Education Partnership that I know you know well and work closely with too. And Haringey Education Partnership, their wonderful CEO, James Page, and his associates said, would you produce something like this for Haringey in the humanities subjects? Initially, it was just history and geography, but eventually it expanded to RE as well. Although we don't call it RE, we call it religion and worldviews, but we'll go into that later maybe. So I did this for Haringey with Steve, and we began to produce a fully resourced Key Stage 2 curriculum with a lot of training on how to use it. And it just sort of took off, I think, beyond our expectations. And neighbouring local authorities and some MATs started to say, oh, I think we'd like to have this. Can we buy it? And at that point, we decided that we needed to incorporate as a company, go into a formal partnership with Haringey, and Opening Worlds proper was born. And now 287, I looked it up just before the call to see how many it was, 287 primaries nationally are now doing it. So we've expanded everywhere. We've got 47 schools in Liverpool and then growing communities around Liverpool. We've got 43 schools in Newcastle. We've got a huge community growing now in the southwest with 5 different MATs doing it and so on and so forth, and a big kind of centre of gravity in Birmingham. So these communities take up Opening Worlds. But the really interesting thing for me is instead of just creating something and selling it and saying, bye-bye, off you go, hope it works, and maybe having a bit of feedback and a bit of evaluation as you go along, is we only work with communities, minimum of 6 schools, and most of them much larger than that, We only work with a community that can establish itself as a leader, establish a leader who can be the Opening Worlds cluster lead. And we liaise very, very closely with that leader. And that makes our feedback loop really strong. So that, in a nutshell, is what Opening Worlds is. It's something that's quite dynamic in its development because we work closely with those key leaders. We get those leaders together for a big session, a big jamboree every September, where we really think about the substance of the curriculum or what it's for and what we're trying to achieve. And those leaders in those local communities work to make sure that implementation is really tight. So it stands or falls on fidelity of implementation, really. You know, we say, if you don't really want to get in bed with this, if you don't like it, if you only want half of it, well, fine, thanks, but no thanks. well, you know, we would rather make sure that this works than have a lot of kind of not very good versions. So that's my main role, really, as director of Opening Worlds.
Well, it's fun. It's amazing. And I know. So you know, it's not a total coincidence that Haringey Education Partnership is who we've asked to run our podcast now. So because we're sort of working with them in so many fronts, and so I've had the experience of being in a lesson where the teacher was using the Opening Worlds materials. You know, in the last few months, I think it was a world views unit about philosophers, I think. And what I'm pretty sure I got wrong. And she was telling them who Plato was, and so was that one of yours? I'm not sure. Maybe it wasn't.
It doesn't sound like one of ours. No, I mean there is something in ancient Greece where we do mention Plato.
It wasn't.
It doesn't sound like it. No.
Okay, this is what it was. This is the challenge. Then I must have mismade that assumption, but it was a thing where the teacher was teaching about Socrates, and he came Plato, and Plato came out. Plato was a philosopher. What's a philosopher? And it was clear to me that the teacher was trying her best to run this unit, but it was sort of so new to her as a knowledge set.
Yeah.
That she was, you know, she was learning with the students and was clearly knew more than they did, but her command of the material was embryonic. And you had the experience of working in a multi-academy trust across schools, and so how do you see this working? How do you, because crafting it, you must spend hours sort of thinking about what to write and all the materials, and then you don't actually really deliver any of the lessons. You have to get other people to do that. So what's your process to bring them up to that point where they
that's a really good question, actually. I mean, I don't recognize that lesson particularly, but anyway, maybe it was from some other program, I don't know. But anyway, the process of bringing them up to speed is we have quite a thorough implementation process. This isn't true of Haringey, which is a bit different, but in terms of the other communities around the country, because Haringey kind of grew up piecemeal. But in our various communities around the country that have adopted Opening Worlds, they spend a term in what we call an implementation phase. So in that implementation phase, the very first thing we do is we do a session for head teachers. And we go into great detail. It's a 2-hour-long session. We explain the rationale behind it, the relationship between knowledge and literacy, the reason why knowledge matters, the reason why subjects matter, what constitutes rigor in subjects, why it matters for inclusion in society, why it matters for democracy, you know, all the rationales around knowledge. We make sure that the heads really get it and are on board, lots of scope for the heads to ask questions. And make sure that they're understanding the rationale behind it. Because if you fall at that fence, there is no point in going any further. If your leaders don't like it, your leaders don't want it, and they're not going to be behind it, I'm talking to two of you as ex-leaders, you know exactly what I mean, then it's pointless. So that's the first stage. That's part one of implementation phase. And then we move into part two of the implementation phase, which is 2 substantial training sessions. And again, you won't have seen this in Haringey. This is what we do nationwide. In some ways, Haringey trials it for us, and then we learn from there and we move on elsewhere. So we then have 2 3.5-hour training sessions, and they're for the teachers. And the school only rolls out the Year 3 program in the first instance. There's no way you could roll out the Year 4 or Year 5 or Year 6 program because the children wouldn't be ready for it. If your superpower is sequencing, if one thing is possible because of what comes earlier, then you know, there's no way you could just suddenly plunge into the Year 4. It would not be inclusive. There'd be too much vocabulary, they'd be unfamiliar. So the schools then learn how the Year 3 program works. We train them in some detail through remote training sessions. We then give them advice on how to begin to develop that in school. And before they get anywhere near rolling it out, they do a practice unit. So we have a unit on the Stone Age, which is kind of geared at end of Key Stage 1. So it's kind of, you know, summer 2 for year 2. And they do that as their practice unit to get used to the pedagogies, to get used to the content, to get used to the relationship between the whole class oral work and reading text and so on. And having done that practice unit, they then have another training session, another 3.5-hour training session, which of course makes more sense when you've actually had a bash at it yourself. And then finally, we have a surgery where they just come on board, come online live and ask Steve and I endless questions. You know, we had a bit of a problem with lesson 4, or how exactly do you do this in lesson 5 or whatever of this unit? So it's a very intensive, and as far as we can make it, interactive process. Then there's development days, annual development days, once they're on board, and they grow and grow and grow. And this gets close to the nub of the question I think you've just asked there, Tom, which is you've absolutely got to get secure in the knowledge. And that's one reason why I think it's worth preparing it for teachers, because otherwise, how have they got any hope of doing that?
Yeah.
And we give all kinds of advice for doing that. I mean, the first thing is you take the booklet. I grabbed one off the shelf. So here's a year 6 booklet on Ethiopia, which is quite long and fat, being year 6, Geography Ethiopia. And we give them a kind of routine or procedure for doing this, which is to get to know the booklet first really, really well before you go anywhere near the PowerPoint slides. And then we have whole training sessions, a bit in the earlier year, but then more and more and more in the subsequent years, where you start to understand that a lesson works around the rhythms of its texts. So it's not about, I'm going to do this, these isolated things. It's what's the journey? What's the flow? Where's it going? And is it mostly driven here by narrative? Sometimes it is. Is it mostly driven here by analysis? Is it more an analytic journey as we're gearing up to our inquiry question or a debate or whatever it is? Is it somewhere where we're actually looking at the beauty of the text itself? So we craft some historical fiction here and there as a means to get into sense of period, for example. So really make sense of the text and understanding how the text flows as a text, not as isolated facts. And we train the teachers, layering it bit by bit, not expecting them to be brilliant at this in their first year, but getting them used to the idea of what it means to really know that content in your head. Because then paradoxically, the better the structure of the lesson, the more you can actually be free with it and intelligent with it and play with it. Now, the other thing that kind of links in with that is that the development days are all about developing subject leadership too. So we will run sessions that are specifically about training subject leaders. So, you know, how do you need to be a step ahead of the game? What does it mean to be a geographical thinker? Why does geography matter? Why might it matter in the world? Why might it matter in a primary education? How might it sit in relationship to English or in relationship to wider personal development? All those kinds of very rich questions, and then trying to get a nice blend all the time between those bigger questions and the subject knowledge questions and the third part of the triangle, which is the practical pedagogy. And we knew you'd never do that in 1 year. And we knew you'd never do it one off. You've got to layer it, layer it, layer it, layer it.
Well, it's such a thorough approach. So it's amazing. So Emma, what's your sense of it? What's your awareness of the opening worlds? So if you come across it.
I have come across it. In fact, I was doing some training with some teachers up in Liverpool about cognitive science for primary, and they were mentioning that they were using the resources there. And then I was over in the Fens doing some similar training for cognitive science teaching learning, and they were mentioning that they're using this. So it's like everywhere I go, it keeps popping up. But what I wanted to ask was, obviously, it's for Key Stage 2 at the moment.
Yeah.
Are there any kind of particular considerations for curriculum design in a primary that primary practitioners need to be aware of that might be different or coming at it from a slightly different angle than compared to older students?
So do you mean that teachers need to be aware of in terms of
teachers and curriculum designers, anybody who's working in the primary phase? Is there anything in terms of sort of curriculum design and associated planning and sequencing that you need to be aware of for younger students rather than working with students who might be slightly older?
I think the only thing, well, not the only thing, but the key thing is simply the opportunities that are there in primary, which are not there in secondary. So the opportunity to secure strong connection between the subjects, I mean, you can do that in secondary, but my goodness, it requires quite a complex mapping exercise, and usually a civil war, actually, in the secondary school, because, you know, trying to get your history and your English and your geography aligned is unbelievably challenging, and often the best you can manage are just certain links and so on. But in primary, you can really make the most of that, can't you? Because you are usually, in the vast majority of cases, you are teaching the children all the time. So something that you can do in primary, I think, which you can't do in secondary, or rather that you can guarantee in primary, if you build it in, is not only to make sure that the access that the children have in year 4 and year 5 and year 6 is better, greater, because of what they've done before, but also it's better and greater because of what they've done before in other subjects. So we only work on 3 subjects, although our connection with literacy is very strong, that sometimes it feels like 4, and there's often a lot of very, very strong weaving with English. But just to give you one example, which you don't really see in secondary, nothing like to this extent anyway. So we open with a study of rivers at the beginning of year 3, not that unusual. We do 2 case studies and 2 very different rivers, a river in this country, the River Severn, and the River Indus. And there are lots of reasons for that. Geographically, they have a lovely contrast. It's a good way to understand certain key features of rivers that crop up. Both the similarities and the differences help to embed it for the children. But more especially in doing the River Indus, when we are over in our RE program doing Hinduism, which we do at exactly the same time, we know the territory, we know the setting, we smell it, we feel it, we see it around us. The world building is done for us by the geography. And one of the things I love about it is just the kind of joy and delighting really in the children. So, you know, the first shot we show them, having told them a few stories, we show them where we are, and their eyes widen. They go, it's the River Indus. They can't quite believe it because they already know it. And then crucially, our 3rd history unit, still in year 3, is the Indus Valley civilization. And you know, once you start to get that kind of join up between history and geography and RE, you get what, you know, so many primary practitioners have always been passionate about, which is that connection and that you know, those cross-curricular links. But very often, sometimes in the past, they were driven by the cross-curricular links, you know, doing a topic rather than driven by actually rigor within the subjects. So it's a kind of way of having your cake and eating it. And I've never experienced that to that extent, anywhere near to that extent in secondary, and nor the just the delight and the joy as they sense their recognition of it, you know, as the children start noticing the things that have happened elsewhere. So although we stay very true to the disciplinary thinking that the subject commands, we're very, very careful to make sure we're not asking theological or moral questions in history. And we're very, very careful to make sure the types of historical questions are asked. So although there's rigor within the subjects, we're very clear that critical thinking isn't good if you're not clear about your epistemological basis. At the same time, in terms of the substantive knowledge, they're just feeding each other really like crazy. So there's just much, much more that they can draw on. And I think because you've got the same teacher teaching all 3, that it's a very, very different experience.
It's interesting working with a group of teachers today, talking about this connected curriculum approach, exactly this. And the phrase I used was, secondary teachers would give their right arm to be able to make the connections in a day that you have in a primary setting. Because whilst you're teaching your geography, you can reference your science. While you're teaching your science, you can reference your maths. And you can make all of those nice little recaps and retrievals that you can't necessarily do if you're working in different departments and teaching a portion of the curriculum rather than the whole curriculum. Sorry, Tom, what were you saying?
And you not only know, sorry, I'm jumping in here, but you not only know those curricula, but you know how the children received it. That's the strength of it, isn't it? You know the children. So you can say, you know, do you remember, you know, when we were having this debate in the last lesson, you know, what Fred said? And it's that profound connection, isn't it, with those particular children's learning in the other subjects.
What I want to, I mean, because the Indus Valley is, I remember you did a curriculum masterclass. You were one of the stalwarts of our curriculum masterclass online things we did for a few years, and I remember you talking about that as an example and the way it wove things together, and it also allows you to discuss the whole issue of disciplinary knowledge versus substantive knowledge. And I'm really interested in this whole interplay and your take on the debate around a knowledge-rich curriculum, and what at the end of year 3 or later in year 5 or whatever, what is the core of what children should have learnt from their year 3 curriculum that matters versus the kind of general sense of things that they get along the way. Do you know what I mean? It's such a subtle thing. Like, you're really trying to nail it and say you really need to know this, but that's just background. There's so much layered into that, even those 3 examples you gave. So just tell us a bit about that. What's your sense of this idea of what do the children really need to know there that you're trying to emphasize through that teaching?
It's really hard. It depends what you mean, Tom. It depends what you mean by what do they really need to know.
Yeah.
If we were talking about a subject that was more hierarchical, a subject that was more age related, like mathematics, for example, then we might be talking about, where a child perhaps needs to be in terms of maturation and the interplay of instruction and maturation that should lead them to be wherever at the end of year 3. You can't do that with a cumulative subject. If a subject is cumulative, fundamentally cumulative, rather than hierarchical, there is no earthly reason why coasts should come before rivers or rivers should come before coasts. History is a little bit different because I think, well, they don't have to move chronologically through history. It's an awful lot easier if you do, because it's more interesting and it's more accessible. But even in history, you can't totally move chronologically through because you're wanting to be in different parts of the world. So of course you might sometimes advance forward in the Anglo-Saxons and then move back a little bit in Arabia. So even there, you can't really say, this is where every child should be by the end of year 3. I don't think it's meaningful. What you can say is, what you can do is talk about, and I think this is quite a helpful concept, even though it's a bit of a mouthful, you can talk about cumulative sufficiency. And I think that's a helpful concept for thinking about it. That, if I choose, and it is a big if I choose to do rivers, and then mountains, and then settlements, and then, I don't know, deserts or whatever it is, in that order in year 3, and obviously all sorts of connections between those. Or, I don't know, I choose to do volcanoes, and then a little bit later, earthquakes. What you can do is talk about the cumulative effect of those things being joined up, and the broader vocabulary of the subject that it's giving you. What you're trying to do in saying this special way of looking at the world called history, this special lens that allows you to read the world historically, to ask historical questions of the world, to solve problems, to look at the challenges of our time in historical ways. This special way of looking at the world geographically, what kinds of things do geographers do? How do they solve problems? What do they see as problems? In terms of, that's what you're trying to do ultimately, isn't it? We're trying to send them away into secondary, and in secondary send them out into the world, where 99% of them will drop these subjects. We're doing it because it's general education. Sending them out to understand that there are distinctive ways of seeking truth in this human race and on this planet, and that historians seek truth through particular kinds of argument, and they have certain standards as to what counts as a claim and what counts as evidence. A historian would never ask a question like, I don't know, was Henry VIII right to leave Rome? It's not even a historical question. But historians ask different kinds of questions. They ask questions about causality or change or continuity. Geographers ask questions about relationships between spaces. They ask questions about a different kind of change, a much more future-orientated change, and the relationship between phenomena and forces that shape our planet. Theologians, philosophers, they're all distinctive seekers of truth. Scientists seek truth through the empirical method, and have a particular way, don't they, of advancing and testing a claim.
You say that's the more important thing, because I mean, it's funny that you mention. I feel like I'm a one-trick pony in this area, but it is, you mentioned it, so I'm going to dare to, which is Henry VIII, because in my training, it's a story I often use about how much knowledge we assume children might have, and it was I tell the story of a year 8 teacher recapping why did Henry break away from Rome.
Yeah.
And the boy next to me was saying, but I thought he lived in London, and then I had to explain, no, Rome, where the Pope lived and the Catholic Church. And he said, but I thought they were Christians. And I was saying, so I had to explain to him, Christians, Catholics, Protestants, and it's like, in that word Rome, there's this whole schema of of substantive knowledge, and because he didn't have that,
Yeah.
the question didn't resonate with him. So there is a stuff you need to know as well, and it's such a complex thing, isn't it?
I think the point is that, I mean, I came around to the disciplinary there because you've got to think about that as the ultimate thing.
Yeah.
You know, in the end, a lot of this content, let's face it, is interchangeable. You know, we've all got quite parochial lenses. We here, of course, in Britain, see certain British stories, and I would say, yes, over here in this part of Europe, one should understand those basic stories. If you're going to understand governmental institutions of today, if you're going to understand legal systems of today, if you're going to understand your own set of rights and responsibilities of citizens, you need to understand how institutions have developed through time and the mingled political and religious origins of our institutions in this country is one example of why you most certainly should know about the Reformation. Yeah. So if we flip, I mean, the disciplinary is perhaps your ultimate, but I couldn't agree more. If you don't underpin that with really, really secure substantive knowledge, sufficient, but I come back to cumulative sufficiency again. I cannot be dogmatic about exactly how much of which and what you put in. Yeah. But if you don't have sufficient, connected and meaningful and secure, it's secure there in long-term memory knowledge, you're not going to be able to ask any of these interesting questions. You're not going to be able to answer them, let alone ask them. So you've got to, what you've got to do with the cumulative subjects, the subjects where there isn't an obvious hierarchy. I mean, there isn't that obvious a one in science, but it is a bit more obvious. You know, you don't start doing mitochondria, do you, before you learn what a cell is. So whereas in history, I could learn one topic before another. I can teach the Incas to 6-year-olds perfectly well, and I can also teach the Incas at postdoctoral thesis level. So, you know, you can, it's interchangeable, you can put it anywhere. But having accepted that, you then have to plump for a content journey. And I would say that content journey needs children to be secure. And that's where the delight comes. That's where the joy comes, because they see the connections. And I would say if you're sloppy about that, just to stick with the substantive, if you're sloppy about that in any way, then you're denying children certainly the opportunity to go on and ask those richer disciplinary questions, to answer them, let alone ask them. But you're also just denying them the reference points which enable them to even think, to have something to think with in the first place. And, you know, I'll give you a good example. Sometimes in really weak teaching of the Vikings, you see schools sort of just trying to set a question, really potentially quite a good question, which is, I don't know, what kind of a threat did the Vikings pose to people in Britain? That's not a brilliant question, but it is okay. Something about, you know, how distinctive was their lifestyle? How far did it affect Britain? What kind of morality did the Vikings have, or whatever? How far have the Vikings influenced us today? Just randomly thinking some question. And the answers that the children come up with, even though they're in year 5 and 6, and they've been doing history for a hell of a long time, are so superficial, so trivial, so unhistorical, that they're really not worth it. They're not leaving children with reference points. And often it's quite bad history, you know, so they're actually even peddling out of date and unscholarly stuff. What is it that makes that happen? Well, how can a child go into something much richer? Well, they've got to have secure building blocks. So I would say you really need to understand the well, they're not even Anglo-Saxons. There's no such thing as an Anglo-Saxon. The Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, the Germanic tribes. You really need enough stories, an adequate, sufficient kaleidoscope of stories to understand the modes of ruling, the emergence of law codes, trade, the relationship between security in towns and trades. And I would say you need some really strong stories and strong personalities. And you have to make choices. It's not like science where there's some very obvious things you can't miss out. We make the choice of, we do Alfred the Great, obviously, and all the obvious people. We make sure they know about Alfred and Edward and Athelstan, of course, the fundamental moment of the founding of England. But we make a really big fuss of Ethelfled, you know, who is only recently really being acknowledged as one of the crucial founders of England that she was. And through her, we learn about education, we learn about attitudes towards women, we learn about what is typical, what is atypical, but above all, we get a thrilling story to hang it all on. And then when our Vikings come, what we're beginning to understand is it's not a case of, I'm going to do Anglo-Saxon Britain, now I'm going to do Viking Britain, you know, separate topics. The country was forged from an interplay. It's Angles and Saxons and Vikings working in interplay, and that's complex. And the only way you're going to get that and not get lost and fed up and lose the will to live, aged 8, aged 9, is with some strong stories in the mix that are really secure, really gripping, and then a clear sense of detail around it. So I would say you achieve it by securing an optimal interplay of the general and the particular, the big generalizations, the big themes, and the detail, and the optimal interplay of some key stories that the children get to know really, really well, around which you can weave some of the more optional stuff. And through that, we get to learn these different spheres of action. I focused on history there because you focused in on history, but the same is true, that structures are different for the other subjects.
Makes a lot of sense. Emma, what are you thinking? What are you thinking about that?
I'm thinking I'm really glad I said the right thing on the training. I was talking to the colleagues about the importance, yes, of a knowledge-rich curriculum, but it's the specific knowledge that you pick that helps children to make sense of the period of time that you're talking about and the changes that happen during that period, and that there is no point amassing loads and loads of information that means nothing to the children. And we were talking about the difference between children being able to retell the stories of the curriculum with confidence and clarity and understanding versus being able to regurgitate lots of historical facts that they don't actually understand. And I think there's been a conflation sometimes with some colleagues that I've worked with, that more information equals better curriculum, rather than actually really deeply understanding key narratives that the children can then retell with understanding, peppered with the fact that they remember, but they understand the story rather than a big bank of facts.
Is this why, Christine? Because one of the things I think is a feature of the resources I've seen, and I have seen them in the Haringey office, I've browsed through them all. I mean, they look like storybooks to begin with. I mean, and there's a lot of reading, and then there's graphics and there's images. So you get a sense of trying to create a sense of visualization and imagining, but also the stories that are dominant. So you do a lot of reading, but also I've heard you talk about the fact that there's an oracy, there's an oral tradition that comes through as well. So there's just two, there's the reading and the speaking. So tell us a bit about that. Why are those two things so important to
well, you've kind of summed it all up there, Tom. You know, I mean, I can't say it better than how you've just said it, really. And it ties in with what Emma's just said too, that the oracy and the reading. If I can just tie that together with this thing, you put it very well, I thought, Emma, with a knowledge-rich curriculum is not a fact-rich curriculum. It's not an information-rich curriculum. Information is not knowledge. Information is free-floating facts. And that is really pointless. It's not memorable. You're not going to remember it. And it hasn't helped you navigate the subject, because the subject is about connection and relationship and meaning. And each subject makes meaning in different ways. So, you know, that's the last thing you want. So how are you, and one of the reasons we want children, one of the many reasons we want them to have this knowledge, it's partly so they can read the world in these powerful ways that I talked about earlier, reading it historically, reading it geographically. But another reason that's linked in with that is we want them to have vocabulary. Because if I don't have abstract vocabulary, if I don't have the verb deposit and the noun deposition and the verb erode and the noun erosion, when I'm talking about coasts and coastal processes, or I'm talking about what's going wrong in the Indus Valley or whatever it is, if I don't have language like establishment, authority, government, institutions, I can't describe the world and I can't explain the world. And I certainly can't analyze the world, and I will never be able to change the world or hold my own in an argument about the world. So giving the children this thorough vocabulary, that's what the subjects do. And of course, then that vocabulary bursts out of those subjects and gains metaphorical and literary power. So, you know, we learn the word erode in geography, but my goodness, it's then powerful in a metaphorical way in the literature we're reading. Or we learn, you know, the idea of an offering when we're exploring theology, but then we can talk about something being offered up in a broad way. So the vocabulary is the outward expression of an inward acquisition of knowledge. It's the outward expression of an inward acquisition of knowledge. And one of the things we do in our pedagogy, and there's no rocket science here, you know, I mean, you do it through walkthroughs, and so many people emphasize it in the pedagogy, is that we specify where in the curriculum the new words crop up. So we'll have between 20 and 30 words for each new unit, each half-term unit in each subject. And those words are first taught at that moment. And then when Steve and I and our consultants write the subsequent texts in years 4, 5, and 6, we make damn sure all those words, and not just words, but noun phrases, idiomatic expressions, crop up again and again and again. So you get to practice it over, you know, an expression like take captive. Well, let's make sure we crop it up again and again. But when we first meet the word, we do a lot of its pedagogy we took from Read, Write, Inc. actually. And then we adapted it and just did, you know, looked at some other research and put it together. We do masses of choral response. And we have enormous fun with choral response, and we're very, very thorough about it. And when we're supporting schools to kind of improve their pedagogy, we really emphasize the inclusive nature of that. Yeah. And then we get beyond choral response and have lots of protocols around asking questions, the territory that you're very familiar with. We have little rules like don't ask 1, ask 5. And we train the teacher to rearrange the question, so the child has to rearrange the sentence. So they're using the word in lots and lots of different ways. We're not dogmatic about this answering full sentences, other than sometimes. So there's certain types of protocol where, yes, full sentences, please. But there's other kinds of settings and being more reflective, but we might not require it. So those are just 2 examples of intensive oral work. So you have we always say, if there is a single child at the end of the lesson who did not wrap their tongue and their lips around the word monument or establishment, and you weren't checking that they were saying the T in it, that child is being excluded. That child is left out of the subsequent discussion. That child is less likely to read the text. You're widening the gap. So we get very emphatic about it like that. And we also just show what fun it is. Because my goodness, the fun you have as a whole class doing all kinds of fun oral work, from choral response to these more creative things. So we don't bump into the text, just to complete your answer to your question. We don't bump into reading the long text. So children are reading about 1,000 words a lesson in all 3 subjects by the end of year 5. And they don't read that text, they don't go anywhere near that text until they are 100% confident in all the new vocabulary and until the teacher has already taught them the content. So here we're quite different from some other programs which say they're knowledge rich, and a lot of it is read the text, do comprehension exercises, read the text, do comprehension exercises. We do a lot of our work of building knowledge orally. Sometimes it's storytelling, it depends on what we're up to. Sometimes it's the children that are telling the story back again. We do an awful lot of work orally. The teacher explains quite a lot, so we train the teachers as storytellers too, a lot of straightforward exposition and Q&A, and a range of other quite creative pedagogies as well. We do, you know, bits of drama and all the rest of it. And then, and only then, usually towards the end of the lesson, do we read the text. And the teacher reads the text aloud to the children. Although over time, we do bits of echo reading, where the teacher reads something and plays with the intonation and the child reads it back again. The children then read independently in the text after that, when they're doing all the follow-up and extended activities. So we really invest everything in getting the children able to read those texts independently, but we don't expect them to stumble over that from the off. And the last thing I'd say is, we have whole development days where we train the teachers on how to read aloud well.
Really? Wow.
Because otherwise, you know, there's just nothing worse, is it, than just kind of, you know, flat, monotone, using wood or dried animal manure for cooking causes a number of problems. You know, so you can't read a sentence in isolation. It's like a piece of music, isn't it? You wouldn't play the cadence at the end of the piece of music on its own. The motif that you're hearing comes from hearing it earlier on. The whole piece of music counts. So we say, you know, the ear, your ear as teacher and the children's ear as listeners and learners really matters. So feel the direction of the text.
Can
use that to read the text really, really well.
I want to share something with our listeners here, because this is not from open worlds, but from connected worlds, which I think is your key stage 3 as a development.
Oh yeah, that's another project. Yeah,
and this is just on your Twitter feed recently, so I know these books are just coming out, and a lot of history are super excited about it. So this is just a little bit, and this to me is just great, because this is, I don't know if a lot of people associate this with being a history textbook, but this is I'm just going to read a bit. I just think this is amazing. So it says, chapter 9, meanwhile, in the world of ideas, a 12th century Renaissance story. In 1116, while Henry I still reigned in England, a wealthy English nobleman began his long journey home. For 7 years, the nobleman had travelled. His birthplace, the ancient city of Bath, was a distant memory. Finding his way back to England, the nobleman followed well-worn pilgrim routes. He travelled the roads and sea routes of crusading armies. He rested in monasteries. Wherever he went, his green flowing cloak made people turn their heads. Who could he be? It's like, oh, this is great.
Yeah,
This is
that's what history should be like, isn't it? It should be,
yeah.
oh God, you mean the lesson's over? I can't wait till next lesson.
Who could it be? It's such a great thing to do. I love it.
Really matters. But I think you've hit on something else there. And this is, it's the oldest pedagogy in the world. It's what primary teachers and secondary teachers have often done well, although it's gone in and out of fashion, hasn't it? It gets demonized 1 minute and then loved the next. And that is just story, narrative itself. And we've talked a bit about the kind of overall narrative of the curriculum, but there are the little narratives, aren't there, on which you hang things. And here I think great narrative theory and philosophy helps us as much as cognitive science, because great narrative theory tells us, it's exactly, I'm so glad you took that example of Adelard of Bath. It tells us that story works because it places the listener or the reader in a heightened state of attention. And it places us in a heightened state of attention, just to switch to cognitive science now, during the encoding phase, which is when you need to be in a heightened state of attention. And the reason you're in a heightened state of attention is because what you don't know. And the beauty of story is that story, I think that my favorite narrative theorist is a guy called Wolfgang Iser. But also Hemingway wrote about this with his iceberg theory. People were tweeting about that yesterday as well. That it's the gaps and the spaces and the silences that make you read on. Yeah, and I often say to the teachers when we're training them, think of the last Netflix series that you binge watched. Think of the last novel you couldn't put down. Think of any old film. How does it work? It works because it flings questions at your brain and you're thinking, what is going to happen next? And that is like text. Text works like that too. It's not a bucket of information. It is actually planting things to create desire, and teaching, it seems to me, is the cultivation of desire. You are making those children say, what's going to happen next? And your best friend is just good text, because that's what great text does. It doesn't have to be a full-blown story, like that lovely little example of the Adelard story, although let's use those wherever we can. But it has to have a sense of, what is it portending? What may come? And that is something I think that obviously we do the heavy lifting, say in Opening Worlds, or in my team, is a much bigger team with this, about 25 people, the secondary thing. We do the heavy lifting in crafting the little stories, weaving them together with the big stories. But in the end, the teacher needs to read the thing pregnant with possibility. And that's cultivating your story reading voice, your pauses. The way you read that, you read it with such kind of verve, and you paused, you had, comments.
Do it. So, I mean, it's the way it's written as well. It invites you to do it. I mean, so is that how you used to teach history?
Yeah, it is. I think I was quite an exhausting teacher, really. I think I probably left the pupils ridiculously overexcited. But yes, I mean, I, as a trainer of teachers, I always said, think of your lesson and then your sequence of lessons as a great text. What does the text do? It withholds. It doesn't tell you what's coming. And that's quite an interesting challenge, because pedagogically, a lot of the time we're told, tell them where you're going, state your objectives, and kind of yes, but no. The children must have a clear sense of direction, but don't do that in a clunky way that doesn't. And this is where it was something I wrote about recently in an article, nothing to do with those projects. Don't move too far from the natural form of accounting that is your subject. It's like these English lessons where you feel we never actually bathe in the text. We're never actually spending time allowing the thing itself to do its work upon us, to have the effect on the reader, whether that's through listening or through reading. And history too has its forms of accounting, and geography too has its forms of accounting. They're often more inquiry-led. But those forms of accounting, they guide you as to the shaping of the text. And that helps you feel the rhythm of a lesson. And so I think going right back to the example you gave at the start, it's quite common, I would say, for a novice teacher generally, never mind a novice with a new program, to be a bit clunky, because they're saying, you know, I've got to do this bit, I've got to do this bit, and oh God, I can't remember it. And they might be clinging a bit to the PowerPoint. And I think we just have to be patient with them. And over time, they can make it their own. And I think all those of us designing programs or writing textbooks, that should be our goal, really, actually. You know, we should be working ourselves out of a job. We're creating something powerful for people to use, but we're actually trying to create the subject curriculum thinkers of tomorrow, trying to model it for them.
I'm just imagining in my head, Christine, when somebody's learning, when you think about the teacher education bit and how to implement this, is when you first learn a play, and you're having to act it out and hold the script there. You haven't internalized the stage directions, and you're having to look at it for prompts. And with practice, you eventually put the script to one side. You've internalized the stage directions. You know what you're going to say, and you can also focus on the intonation and the emphasis and what have you. So
teachers too need to free up working memory, and that's going to take up time, isn't it? The cognitive load is just too great when you first start. You know, or sometimes when you do a new presentation or something, you feel it yourself, don't you? Still, you think, oh, I'm overloading myself here, and I haven't got wriggle room. Or my husband's a conductor, and he likes with some of his choirs to reach the point where they're singing entirely from memory. Because it's just, you know, and they will sing, you know, something absolutely huge. They'll do the whole of the Christmas oratorio or the whole of the Frank Martin Mass or something entirely from memory. It takes them ages to work up to that. But when they do, there's nothing but their ears, the people around them that they're listening to. And he makes them sing scrambled so that they're all, you know, soprano and alto and tenor and bass and mixed up with each other. So they're hearing the harmonies, and it's just his eyes. And he can, you know, retune the sopranos with his left eyebrow or whatever, whilst also doing something where I don't know how you do that, but apparently you do. Well, it's funny when I watch him and hear him in rehearsal, it's so like what a teacher does, bringing himself to the point where, bring the choir to the point where they're no working memory overload. They're just free. And then what's exciting about it is that then it's a dynamic process. Because conductor and choir, you're still learning about the piece, you're still interpreting it. You know, you're not going to get bored of the John Passion, are you, when you've sung it 35 times? You're just going to find another new layer in it. And that's where I think it isn't stultifying, it's actually liberating sometimes for teachers to have a strong textbook or a strong curriculum, because, you know, the quality of discussion you have with your peers, your fellow teachers, the richness you can eventually bring to it. And eventually you can riff on it a bit and depart from it. But what it's doing is actually liberating you to make time to gain more knowledge and to be an educated person in front of the children. That's it too. It's modeling, isn't it? This is what educated people do, child. You know, they love reading. They're nuts about music. They go to galleries, they discuss, they argue about politics, and they argue about geographical questions. And you be that person in front of the children. I think this is something that Michael Young really meant, you know, the great theorist around knowledge in curriculum, when he said teachers need to have a relationship with the knowledge that they teach. And I think that's one of the things we're talking about. We shouldn't expect it to come quickly, but we can give them a leg up. We can give them a bit of help.
I find this is, I remember when we did our masterclasses events and people asked you questions at the end, one of the questions that came up all the time was, the people are sort of listening in awe at you describing curriculum richness and sequencing and this connectedness. But then they were thinking, how do I get to the point where I know what you know? And you have to talk about sort of functional things like structures of CPD in schools where the time is given to teachers to engage, and like your programs. I mean, I love the fact you're so sort of committed to this idea that you can't just take our stuff and go. You have to learn how to use it, and that needs to be, that commitment to that is important. And then I guess there has to be enough stability. And once you've invested in the time, you're going to keep to, because the teachers need to do it once, do it again, and then that knowledge takes time to accumulate, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that goes wrong sometimes, doesn't it? And if you're getting rapid changes of leadership in a school, all sorts of issues, it can go wrong. You know, the best will in the world, you can't actually necessarily always choreograph all of that, can you? But I think what you can do, and I suppose that's why I took this decision really to go back to resource production and to do some new stuff with it, is I think what we can do is just give people those building blocks to play with. And do it in a way that's transparent too, so they can, you know, be critical of it and say, well, you know, what scholarship did you draw on here to build this? Where does this come from? How might this change over time? And then at least you're giving them more than a framework, you're just giving them the materials.
Well, I'm itching to see all this stuff, and the Connected Worlds books looks amazing. So look, I think because I'm a science teacher, and I've line managed history departments several times, but I've always, whenever you talk, I always think there's a lot you're saying which is very strongly directed towards the history community, but it resonates with everyone, you know, with the humanities subjects, but for everyone thinking about curriculum. And you know, I just want to say thank you really for the contribution you make there, which is, I think, very significant. Every time you say something like, guys, knowledge rich gone wrong, stop messing it up, you know, so that people go, oh gosh, Christine has spoken, what we need to do this.
Don't you make me sound like the oracle. I
No,
get it wrong as often as I get it right. That's very kind of you, Tom. Thank you.
But it's important, isn't it? And I feel like that's one of the things we try to do on our podcast, to celebrate those contributions that people make, because sometimes they don't get acknowledged. But so I want to say thank you on behalf of lots of people for what you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Directly teaching history, Key Stage 2, 3, and also geography and world. What's it called again? The RE.
The reason we call it religion and worldviews, because the RE Commission 4 or 5 years ago now made a recommendation that it should change its name in an attempt to make it more of an academic subject and make it broader. And we kind of ran with that. We thought, yeah, it should be religion and worldviews, because we should be learning about the great world religions. Yes, that's fundamental, but we should also be learning about a range of other positions, if you like, and such as humanism. And we do branch out actually into philosophy, particularly in year 6. So we just felt that's a better, more modern name. Who knows? That's another whole discussion, isn't it? The future of RE in this country. And I think I would love to see really radical change around RE. I think it should be an academic subject, and I have problems with the whole kind of sacro structure in terms of creating entitlement for children. But yeah, religion and worldview strikes me as a healthier, better way of labelling it. And it gets around some of the misconceptions that still, you know what they are, those misconceptions that sit with, but people still think religious education is religious instruction, don't they? And misunderstand it, and numerous other misconceptions.
I love it when someone comes on here and opens up a whole other podcast worth of debate.
There you go, yeah. Another one for another day.
But we have to wrap it up there. Honestly, Christine, thank you so much. It's been a real joy talking to you.
And it's been an absolute pleasure and lovely to talk to you both. Thank you both for all that you do too. It's absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up now. Thank you to everyone listening to Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe. It's been a brilliant episode. I know a lot of people are going to love it. And thank you for listening. We've got loads of guests in this summer term, and we'll see you again really soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner, and I've been presenting with my co-host Tom Sherrington. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, share on social media, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel, search for Mind the Gap with Tom and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership, and our producer for today's episode was Luke Kemper.